In the cold winter of 1837, a single loaf of bread cost more than a man could earn in a full day of hard labor. This simple truth was the spark that lit a fire under the streets of New York City. It was a time of great change and great trouble. The city was growing fast. People flocked there from all over the world. They came for a better life. They found a hard one instead. The streets were dirty. The air was thick with smoke. The wind cut through thin coats. But the cold was not the worst enemy. Hunger was. New York in the 1830s was a city of extremes. On one side, there were the wealthy. They lived in grand mansions. They wore fine silk clothes. They ate dinner with silver spoons. They rode in fancy carriages. They did not worry about the price of flour. On the other side, there were the poor. They lived in crowded rooms. Whole families slept in one small space. They wore rags. They ate scraps. They walked through the snow in thin shoes. The gap between these two worlds was getting wider. It was a gap that threatened to break the city apart. The year 1837 started with deep worry. The weather had been bad for farming. Crops failed in many places. This meant there was less wheat. When there is less of something, the price goes up. Merchants knew this. They saw a chance to make money. They bought up the flour. They stored it in large warehouses. They waited for the price to rise higher. In their eyes, this was good business. In the eyes of the poor, this was a crime. They saw men starving while flour sat rotting in storage. This was the central controversy. It was a battle between profit and survival. The price of a barrel of flour had doubled. In 1835, a barrel cost about $5 or $6. By early 1837, it cost $12. Sometimes it went even higher. For a working man, this was a disaster. A laborer might earn only $1 a day. A barrel of flour might last a family a month. If he bought the flour, he could not pay rent. He could not buy coal. He could not buy shoes for his children. He had to choose. He could feed his family or keep a roof over their heads. He could not do both. This choice made people angry. It made them desperate. The banks added to the trouble. They lent too much money. They printed too much paper money. This paper money was not worth much. Shopkeepers did not trust it. They raised prices to protect themselves. The value of the dollar went down. The price of bread went up. It was a trap. The poor could not escape it. They worked harder, but they earned less. They scrimped and saved, but it was not enough. The system was broken. The people knew it. They looked for someone to blame. They looked at the merchants. They looked at the banks. They looked at the government. The government did not seem to care. The mayor was a man named Cornelius Van Wyck Lawrence. He was a merchant himself. He understood the world of money. He did not understand the world of hunger. He and the city council did not act fast enough. They thought the market would fix itself. They believed that if they left the merchants alone, the price would go down. They were wrong. The price kept climbing. The anger kept building. January 1837 was a month of whispers. People talked in the markets. They talked on street corners. They talked in the taverns. They asked why there was no bread. They asked why their children were crying from hunger. The newspapers wrote about the distress. The New York Herald and the Sun reported on the high prices. They told stories of suffering. These stories spread the fire. They did not just report the news, they fueled the outrage. People read the papers and felt a shared anger. They were not alone in their suffering. Alexander Ming was a carpenter. He was also a fire warden. He saw the suffering every day. He walked the streets of the Fourth Ward. This was a poor area. It was near the East River. The smell of the water mixed with the smell of garbage. Ming saw families huddled together for warmth. He saw children with swollen bellies. He saw the despair in the eyes of mothers. He felt it himself. His wages had not changed. His costs had soared. He decided he had to do something. He could not stand by and watch. Ming was not a violent man. He was a respected member of the community. He wanted a peaceful solution. He wrote a notice. He called for a meeting. He posted it around the neighborhood. The notice asked people to come together. It asked them to discuss the high price of flour. It asked them to demand action. It was a call for justice. It was a call for bread. The meeting was set for February 10th, 1837. It was to be held at the City Hall Park. This was the heart of the city. It was where the laws were made. It was where the people would make their voices heard. The night of the meeting, the air was biting. Snow lay on the ground. The sky was a dark gray, but people came. They came in the hundreds. They came from the 4th Ward. They came from the 5th Ward. They came from the 6th Ward. They were Irish immigrants. They were German immigrants. They were native-born Americans. They were white and they were black. Hunger does not care about color or origin. They all stood together in the cold. They looked at the steps of City Hall. They waited for leadership. Speakers took the stand. They spoke loudly. They spoke with passion. They talked about the greed of the merchants. They talked about the hoarding of flour. They pointed fingers at specific names. They mentioned the firm of Eli Hart and Company. They mentioned other large dealers. They said these men had thousands of barrels of flour. They said these men were keeping it from the people. The crowd shouted in agreement. They cheered the speakers. They hissed at the names of the merchants. The tension in the park was thick. You could feel it in the air. The speeches went on for hours. Some men wanted to pass resolutions. They wanted to ask the government to set price limits. They wanted the city to buy flour and sell it cheaply. But others were tired of talking. They wanted action. They wanted bread. A man in the crowd shouted. He said talking was useless. He said the merchants would never listen. He said they should go to the source. He pointed toward the lower part of the city. That was where the warehouses stood. That was where the flour was hidden. This shout changed the mood. The crowd began to move. It started as a slow walk, then it became a march. They marched down Broadway. They marched toward Washington Street. Their numbers grew as they walked. People came out of their homes to join them. They came out of the taverns. The crowd became a mob. They carried signs. They carried sticks. They were angry. They were cold. They were hungry. They were an army of the desperate. They had no weapons, but they had numbers. They had rage. Their target was the flour stores of Eli Hart. He was a well-known merchant. He was a wealthy man. He lived in a fine house. He had a reputation for hard dealing. The mob believed he was the main cause of their pain. They reached his store on Washington Street. It was a large brick building. It looked solid. It looked safe. But it was not safe from the mob. They surrounded it. They shouted for Hart to come out. They shouted for him to lower the price of flour. The door remained shut. The windows were dark. The mob did not wait. They picked up stones. They picked up bricks. They threw them at the windows. The sound of breaking glass rang out. It was a sharp, loud noise. It shattered the quiet of the night. The mob cheered. They surged forward. They picked up a heavy beam. They used it as a battering ram. They slammed it against the door, again and again. The wood began to crack. The hinges began to groan. The door was strong, but the mob was stronger. They were driven by hunger. They were driven by a sense of wrong. Inside the warehouse, the air was still. It smelled of grain. It smelled of dust. Thousands of barrels were stacked high. They were full of fine white flour. They were full of potential bread. Outside, men were starving. Inside, wealth was stored away. This contrast was the fuel for the fire. The door finally gave way. With a great crash, it fell inward. The mob poured in. They rushed into the dark warehouse. They were not there to steal. They were there to destroy. They wanted to send a message. They wanted to show the city that they had power. They grabbed the barrels. They rolled them to the door. They threw them into the street. The barrels broke open. The white flour spilled out onto the dirty snow. It looked like a strange white cloud. The men kicked the flour. They stomped on it. They mixed it with mud and slush. They did not take it home to bake. They destroyed it. This was a key point. It was not a simple theft. It was a riot. It was a protest. They wanted to show that they would not let the merchants profit from their hunger. They would rather see the flour in the gutter than in the bellies of the rich. The city was not prepared for this. The police force was small. In 1837, the city did not have a professional police department like we have today. They had a night watch. They had a few marshals. They were not trained for riots. They were outnumbered. They tried to stop the mob. They used their clubs. They shouted orders. But the mob was too big. The police were pushed back. They could not protect the warehouse. They could not save the flour. The rioters had taken control of the street. They were the law now. This was the turning point. The city of New York had never seen anything quite like it. There had been protests before. There had been mobs. But this was different. This was about food. This was about life and death. The destruction at Eli Hart's store was just the beginning. The mob was not satisfied. They had tasted a small victory, but their stomachs were still empty. They looked for other targets. They moved to another store. It belonged to S.H. Herrick & Co. They broke into that one too. They destroyed more flour. They smashed machinery. They broke windows. The damage was in the thousands of dollars. The night air was filled with noise, shouts, screams, crashes. People watched from their windows. They were scared. The wealthy families on the nearby streets locked their doors. They prayed the mob would not come to them. The mob, however, was focused on the food supply. They did not attack homes. They attacked businesses. They attacked the symbols of their hunger. The streets ran white with flour. It was a strange sight. It was a tragic sight. Good food was being wasted while people starved. But in that moment, it felt like justice to the rioters. Mayor Lawrence heard the news. He was at his home. He was told that a mob was destroying the city. He could not believe it. He quickly dressed. He called for the militia. He went to the scene himself. He saw the chaos. He saw the flour on the ground. He saw the broken glass. He saw the angry faces of his citizens. He realized that the city was in danger. This was not just a protest. It was an uprising. It threatened the very order of the city. If the poor could rise up and destroy property, what would stop them from doing more? The mayor tried to speak to the crowd. He stood on a box. He held up his hand. He asked for peace. He asked them to go home. He promised an investigation. He promised to look into the high prices. But the mob did not want promises. They wanted bread. They shouted him down. They threw things at him. He had to retreat. He was the mayor of the largest city in the nation, but on this night he had no power. He was just a man in a crowd of thousands. He realized that words would not stop the riot. Only force would stop it. He sent an urgent message to the National Guard. They were called the 27th Regiment. They were soldiers. They had guns. They were stationed nearby. The commander of the regiment was a man named General Charles Sanford. He received the order. He rallied his men. They marched toward the riot. They marched to the beat of a drum. The sound of the drum cut through the noise of the mob. It was a sound of discipline. It was a sound of authority. The mob stopped what they were doing. They looked down the street. They saw the soldiers coming. The soldiers arrived at Washington Street. They formed a line. They blocked the street. They fixed bayonets to their muskets. The steel points glinted in the gaslight. The crowd faced them. They shouted insults. They threw stones. The soldiers stood firm. They did not fire, not yet. The general gave a warning. He told the mob to disperse. He told them to go home. He said if they did not, he would fire. The mob hesitated. They were angry, but they were not stupid. They knew what muskets could do. They knew that flour was not worth dying for. But some in the crowd were too angry to care. They pushed forward. They dared the soldiers to shoot. They threw more stones. One stone hit a soldier. He fell. The line wavered. The tension was at its peak. This was the climax of the night. The general gave the order. He told his men to prepare to fire. The crowd gasped. Some began to run. Others stood their ground. The moment hung in the balance. A single shot would change everything. It would turn a riot into a massacre. The city held its breath. The soldiers did not fire a volley into the crowd. They fired over their heads. The sound was deafening. The crack of the muskets echoed off the buildings. It was a terrifying sound. It had the desired effect. The mob panicked. They turned and ran. They scattered in all directions. They ran down alleys. They ran into side streets. They dropped their sticks and stones. They just wanted to get away. The soldiers advanced. They cleared the street. They took back control. The riot was over. The silence returned to the snowy streets. But the damage was done. The flour was gone. It lay in heaps on the ground. It was mixed with dirt and blood. The warehouse doors were broken. The windows were shattered. The merchants counted their losses. But the poor counted their losses too. They were still hungry. They were still cold. They had made a statement. They had shown their anger, but they had not solved their problem. They had to go home to their empty rooms. They had to face another day without bread. The soldiers stood guard over the ruined flour. They stood guard over a city that was deeply divided. The Flour Riot was a loud cry in the night, but the silence that followed was louder. The snow melted. Spring arrived in New York, but the warmth did not bring hope. It brought a new kind of fear. The riot in February was about food. The crisis in the spring was about money. It was about the paper in people's pockets. That paper was becoming worthless. This was the trap that had been set years before. In 1837, the trap snapped shut. To understand the hunger, you must understand the money. At this time, the United States did not have a single national currency. There was no dollar bill we know today. Instead, banks printed their own money. A bank in New York could print a $5 bill. A bank in Ohio could print a different $5 bill. They looked different. They had different value. Some were worth their full amount, others were worth less. It was a confusing system. It was a system built on trust. And in 1837, that trust broke. The man at the center of this storm was not a baker or a rioter. He was the President of the United States. His name was Andrew Jackson. He was a tough old man. He hated banks. He especially hated the Second Bank of the United States. He thought it was a monster that helped the rich get richer. He wanted to kill it. And he did. He took the government's money out of that bank. He put the money into smaller state banks. These banks were called pet banks. They were Jackson's pets, but they were wild animals. These pet banks did something dangerous. They printed too much money. They lent it to anyone who asked. People used this easy money to buy land. They bought farms. They bought goods. Prices went up. It looked like a boom. It looked like everyone was getting rich. But it was a trick. The paper money was not backed by gold or silver. It was backed by nothing but promises. New York City was the center of this paper storm. It was the financial capital. Ships filled the harbor. They brought goods. They took away the paper money. The city was floating on a sea of debt. Then came the change. In July 1836, President Jackson issued an order. It was called the Specie Circular. It sounds boring, but it was a bomb. The order said that the government would only accept gold or silver for public land. They would not take paper money anymore. This was the pattern interruption. The game stopped. Suddenly, everyone who had paper money wanted gold. They ran to the banks. They wanted to trade their paper for real metal. The banks did not have the gold. They had lent it out. They had printed too many paper notes. The vaults were empty. Panic spread from the west to the east. It hit New York like a wave. In January 1837, just before the bread riot, the fear was already there. But in May 1837, the fear became a disaster. The banks could not pay. They had to close their doors. Imagine the scene. It is May 10th, 1837. A man walks to his bank on Wall Street. He has a pocket full of paper notes. He worked hard for them. He wants to feed his family. He walks up to the teller. He slides his paper across the counter. He asks for gold. The teller looks down. He shakes his head. He says, "We have no gold." The man is stunned. He asks what his paper is worth. The teller says, "Nothing." This happened all over the city. Banks failed. The biggest banks in New York closed. The United States Bank of Pennsylvania failed. It shook the world. New York merchants who traded with England lost their credit. English banks demanded payment in gold. American merchants did not have it. They went bankrupt. Hundreds of businesses closed their doors in a single week. The streets of New York were filled with men walking aimlessly. They had no jobs, they had no money, and now their savings were gone. The price of bread did not go down, it stayed high, but now people had no money to buy it at all. Before they could scrape together a few coins, now the coins were gone. The shops were empty, the flow of trade stopped. The ships sat in the harbor, stuck. They could not unload their goods because no one could pay. The city froze. This was the controversy. The poor had rioted in February for lower prices. In May, the rich lost their fortunes. The collapse of the banks hurt everyone, but it crushed the poor the most. A key figure in this dark time was a man named Philip Hone. He was a former mayor. He was a rich merchant. He kept a diary. He wrote down what he saw. He did not worry about bread. He worried about order. He worried about the mobs. On May 10th, he wrote about the panic. He called it a disastrous day. He described the crowds on Wall Street. They were not angry mobs. They were terrified crowds. They were silent. They stared at the closed bank doors. They looked at the notices pinned to the wood. The notices said suspended. That was the word, suspended. It meant the bank was dead. Hone wrote about the fear in the homes of the rich. He wrote about the fear of revolution. The wealthy remembered the French Revolution. They remembered what happened when the poor had nothing left to lose. The bread riot in February was a warning. The bank crash in May was a threat. The rich locked their doors. They hired guards. They looked at the city around them and saw a powder keg. They had lost their money. They feared they would lose their lives too. The numbers tell the story. In the first weeks of May, 250 businesses failed in New York City. By the end of the year, the number was in the thousands. Unemployment soared. There were no government safety nets. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no food stamps. If you did not work, you did not eat. The city did try to help. The mayor set up a board of health. It was not for disease, it was for hunger. They tried to create jobs. They hired men to build roads. They hired men to clean streets. The pay was low. It was just enough for a little bread, but it kept men from starving. The situation created a new controversy. It was a political fight. The poor were mostly Democrats. They supported Andrew Jackson. They supported his war on the big bank. But now they were suffering from the result of that war. The Whigs were the other party. They blamed Jackson. They said he destroyed the economy. They said the government needed a new bank. The fight was bitter. It filled the newspapers. It filled the taverns. But the argument did not put bread on the table. The people were tired of arguments. They wanted work. There was a secret history to this panic. It involved the working women of New York. We often think of the rioters as men, but women worked in the factories. They worked in the textile mills. They were paid even less than men. In 1837, the mills cut wages. Some cut them by 25%. Some cut them by 50%. The women had to pay rent. They had to buy food. They could not afford both. In the winter of 1837, a group of women met. They were not in the streets. They were in a hall. They formed a union. They demanded a living wage. They were ignored. This was a quiet riot. It was a silent struggle. They did not burn flour. They just tried to survive. The winter of 1837 became known as the Hard Winter. It was one of the coldest in memory. The East River froze solid. You could walk from Manhattan to Brooklyn on the ice. This had not happened in years. The cold made the hunger worse. Coal was too expensive. Families burned their furniture to stay warm. They burned the wood from their walls. The city was a cold, gray place. The gas lamps flickered in the wind. They lit up faces that were thin and pale. The city government struggled to keep order. The police force was still new. It was called the municipal police. There were only a few hundred officers for a city of over 300,000 people. They walked the beats, they watched the crowds, they were waiting for the next riot. The city was tense. Every argument in the streets seemed like it could start a fire. Merchants lowered their shutters early. They were afraid. The trust between the people and the city was gone. People did not just lose their savings. They lost the ability to trade. Shopkeepers would not accept the paper money from certain banks. They knew the money was bad. So, they would only take coins. But no one had coins. The city ran out of small change. People started using shin plasters. These were little pieces of paper. They were IOUs. A baker might write, "Good for 5 cents of bread" on a piece of paper. That paper became money. The city was trading in promises. It was a sign of how low the system had fallen. The greatest city in the nation was using scraps of paper to buy scraps of bread. The President of the United States was now Martin Van Buren. He took office in March 1837. He was a New Yorker. He knew the city well, but he did not know how to fix the panic. He believed in laissez-faire. This meant the government should not interfere. He thought the economy would fix itself. He refused to create a new national bank. He refused to print government money. He stood by and watched. The people called him Martin Van Ruin. They blamed him for their misery. He was the leader who did not lead. The tension rose again in 1838. The banks reopened briefly. The economy seemed to breathe. It was a false dawn. The underlying problems were still there. The debt was still there. The city was like a sick man who woke up for a day, only to fall back into a fever. The price of bread was still a sword hanging over their heads. The merchants were still cautious. The workers were still desperate. The peace was fragile. It was a silence that begged to be broken. This is the end of the story of the bread riots. It is a story of failure and a story of survival. It reminds us that history is not just about statues and dates. It is about the price of a loaf of bread. It is about the cold wind on a winter night. It is about the fight for a better life. That fight started a long time ago. It continues today. The names change, the streets change, but the struggle remains. And that is the most important lesson history can teach us.